Welcome back to MMA Al Dente. I am the guy who picked Joe Stevenson to defeat Kenny Florian. And I'm here to talk about UFC Fight Night 244, Royval versus Taira. Okay, opening up UFC Fight Night 244 is Lucas Rocha versus Clayton Carpenter. My prediction for this fight is Carpenter wins by decision. And I'm not too confident in that prediction. Really, I haven't seen either guy lose enough to tell you how their losses are going to look, where I could commit to a prop. But I still think Clayton Carpenter, I know he's the bigger man, and I think he's definitely the more likely wrestler and grinder. And in the few fights I've seen him in where he's been competitive, his opponents have been competitive, I'd say, he's been able to push through and win those battles. So there's no real doubts at all in Clayton Carpenter. Seen him look a little vulnerable to calf kicks here and there, but he's always come away with the victory. And his one loss that I should say I know exists is as an amateur, and I haven't been able to see the fight. But it's still a split decision to a guy who could easily be in the UFC right now, Junior Cortez. So on paper, not a bad loss, and I still pretty much consider him a perfect fighter as a pro and amateur. Lucas Rocha, he's been knocked out once. Of course, it happened when he just turned 19, and it was 5 years ago, but he was knocked unconscious. That's his one loss. And that might prove to be a thing. He might have a button on his chin that you just have to push. But I'm not ready to write him off at all as a guy with a weak chin or whatever. He's 24 years old, healthy, and probably getting healthier. And that's the only time it's happened. Clayton Carpenter does have two knockouts with head kicks, but I'd say first knockout in this matchup, probably most of his matchups, goes to Lucas Rocha because he's the much more dynamic guy between the two. I do think Clayton Carpenter is reliable on the feet, though. He's definitely a reliable striker, but I've seen him leave himself open a little too much. And I do think Lucas Rocha is faster, and I mean that with the striking, but also with the movement. And he's the smaller, faster guy, and I don't think Clayton Carpenter is going to do too well chasing him. Clayton Carpenter, I mentioned calf kicks have been a problem. Maybe Edgar Chairez seemed like he could be working them. Edgar Chairez is his best victory. It's his second to last win on the Contender Series. Carpenter won a hard-earned 3-round decision when Chairez, who had like at least 6 inches of reach, was able to stuff his takedowns and work him with rangy striking. But Carpenter pushed through, didn't succumb even in the striking battle, and was able to rip him to the mat in the second half of that fight. And he definitely won with his wrestling, but overall, I thought he looked good, and winning that type of fight in that way is a great look for him. Of course, most opponents he's beaten, he's steamrolled, and that's true of his one UFC victory over Juan Camilo Ronderos, who stepped in on very short notice, and I forget what the circumstances were, but I think he did a favor and still got sent back to out of the UFC after that one loss. He's got another fight booked somewhere else. So I'm just saying that just to say, not the most definitive UFC victory in his debut. But he's looked solid in every other fight. He won one other fight by decision in the LFA over this guy Manuel Medina, and I thought he looked really good there. He was able to make his grappling the story of the fight pretty early. But in round 3, I did think the calf kicks were giving him a lot of trouble. He'd slowed down, and his wrestling had slowed down as well. And yeah, he ran into some trouble there. But I think he was on cruise control because he knew he had won. Regardless, I'm picking him to win because there's no major doubts, and I think there's a distinct advantage in the wrestling, and of course that's complemented by his size. Lucas Rocha, though, if he's able to take away that wrestling, then I think Clayton Carpenter's in a lot of danger. Lucas is the faster guy and the much more dynamic guy. You got to look to his last loss just to see the danger and how it could turn the fight around on a dime. He won on the Contender Series a year ago against Davi Bittencourt, who was taking him down and controlling him, even ragdolling him here and there. But in round two, with a small window to make something happen, he made something happen pretty quickly and knocked him out with a knee as he was coming in, predictably. So that was awesome for Lucas Hosha. A great look for him. And yeah, he's finished 14 of his 17 fights. The guy's got danger on his side. But the basis for the pick would have to be his last two fights. Of course, Davi Bittencourt was able to get on top of him and control him. And so was Mateus da Silva, who was actually Igor da Silva's brother, the guy that got kicked out of the UFC for biting Andre Lima. I believe that's his brother there. And his brother gave him a great fight, Lucas Osha. He controlled Lucas, took him down in all three rounds, and found some form of control. But Lucas was never letting him secure such a dominant position, fought out of every bad spot, and kept enough of it standing where he was the better man. And it was an interesting fight, really close. But even though it went his way, I still think it showed there's a hole there where he can be controlled. And Clayton Carpenter, I think, is the guy to control him. So that's got to be the prediction. I've got Clayton Carpenter controlling him and catching him in the first place, controlling him and winning this fight with that control. But Lucas Hosha, the reason I have doubts is because, of course, what he did to Davi Bittencourt in his last fight, but also he's just got a lot of great experience. He's obviously a healthy young kid. He's got more third round finishes and things like that, even though they may not be over the best opposition, but he's still seen a lot more and done a lot more in his professional career. And I think even though the distinct advantage in the wrestling and control will decide this fight, I could be wrong there. And a decided advantage, a distinct advantage on the feet could be the story of this fight with Lucas Hosha. Again, I've seen Clayton Carpenter's wrestling come alive down the stretch in one fight and maybe fall apart a little bit down the stretch in the other. I haven't seen him fight enough 3 round fights to tell you which one is the real Clayton Carpenter. But I've got to err on the side of UFC level opposition and say it's the one that beat Edgar Chairez. So I'm going with Clayton Carpenter winning that type of fight, but with some reservations. Next up, we have Cody Haddon taking on Dan Argueta. My prediction for this fight is Dan Argueta wins by decision. I don't have too much confidence in that pick either because Cody Haddon looks phenomenal. Looks like the sky's the limit. But I still have to favor Dan Argueta because I do think he can play the role of the American wrestler, which he is, and get inside Cody Haddon striking and put him on his ass or pin him against the cage and do so relentlessly for 15 minutes. I do think it would take 15 minutes of hard work for Dan to win this fight because even though he's mostly a finisher on paper, that's just what I expect from him at the UFC level. But also because Cody Haddon's only suffered one loss, and it was the Steve Herseg when Cody only had a few fights. And on paper, he should have been destroyed, but he gave Steve Herseg his best fight maybe outside the UFC, aside from that one loss, that guy Gauchi or whatever. But Cody Haddon looked phenomenal in that fight against Steve Herseg, and he looked phenomenal in defeat. Maybe he made a sloppy mistake in the end in round three, trying to force a takedown or something. I forget exactly what happened, but I know he lost position and ended up getting mounted in the rest of it. But he still looked really composed in bad spots, tough to dominate, tough to submit, and tough to hold down, especially when he's fresh. And I thought he looked really good in that Ursek fight. He gave him hell in round two, was all over Ursek, put him in a ton of danger. And again, in round three, when the tables turned, I think most fighters would fall apart in that spot, but he didn't. So I think a lot of him so far, even though I haven't seen him lose enough to say he's always going to be that resilient. But I think he will be resilient here. And I got Dan Argueta winning with a grind. You know, whether he has to take him down 3 times or 33 times, I think he's really going to have to work and win this one on points. If Cody Haddon was to win, look, I still have a ton of faith in Dan Argueta's durability. I think he's incredibly tough. I think he's going to be, I can't say impossible, but very difficult to knock out and very difficult to submit. But of course, he was submitted in his last fight against Jean Matsumoto. And that was after I was praising his durability. I think obviously he slowed down, and that was a 10-minute grind at that point. And that guy, Jean Matsumoto, I still don't know what to make of him. He might be the fucking best fighter who ever lived, for all I know. I want to see him fight more in the UFC. But yeah, that guy, I think he's awesome. And Dan Argueta, I still think despite getting finished like that, he's going to be really tough to get out of there. Of course, if Cody Haddon wins by submission, it's really a rear naked choke in which he wins. He's won his last 2 fights by rear naked choke, and those are his only 2 professional submission victories. One guy, Billy Brand, he beat on the Contender Series, and another guy, a reliable Australian grinder brawler guy, Paul Loga, he submitted in round 2. And as an amateur, almost all of his wins are rear naked chokes as well. So he's definitely not just some striker, but I do think the rear naked choke obviously means you got to win the wrestling battle of some sort, and I don't think he'll win that wrestling battle. I do think he can take down Dan Argueta, but I do think Dan Argueta will get up and get back on the grind and be the one winning the wrestling battle. I got to go with Dan here. But Dan, I'm aware he's lost his last 2 fights. You know, the decision over Miles Johns was overturned for whatever reason, but he did lose that fight, and that's because he wasn't able to win the wrestling battle, even though he might have. I forget what the takedown score was, but he wasn't able to make that his fight. Miles Johns was a good match for him in the wrestling, and I thought he had an advantage on the feet. I think Cody Haddon's got an advantage on the feet, but I don't think he's got the same advantage wrestling-wise, and I think Dan will be able to get in his face and outgrind him. Dan, I don't know if I mentioned this in this video yet, but Damon Jackson beat him by decision on short notice when he moved up in weight. And Damon Jackson, who's a monster finisher and an incredibly strong top game grappler, was not able to finish Dan Argueta. He showed he could hang with that guy on his back. So even if Cody's able to get on top of him, a rear naked choke might not come so easily. I still think Dan's going to be a really difficult guy to get out of there and a very difficult guy to get off of him. So yeah, I've got Dan Argueta winning by decision. Don't have the most faith in it because, again, he's been neutralized lately in a few different ways. And Cody Haddon seems like he's got all the upside in the world. But still, the pick is Argueta. Next up, we have Junior Tafa versus Chris Huggy Bear Barnett. My prediction for this fight is Junior Tafa wins by knockout. And my betting strategy is to resist the urge to bet on Chris Huggy Bear Barnett. And I'll probably succumb to that urge sooner than later. But look, Chris Barnett shouldn't win this fight. He doesn't have the wrestling or the grappling to go through Junior Tafa. And I know he doesn't have the leg kicks of Marco Sogerio de Lima. But just on that MMA experience basis, Junior Tafa is only 5-3. And I know 3 of those losses, all 3 of them take place in the UFC. But he's still a limited fighter, technically, but also professionally, he's got limited experience. And Chris Barnett, he's got a lot of experience, a ton of it. And even though he's a limited fighter himself, he is still built like a fucking bowling ball. Where I think if he kind of rolls himself on top of Junior Tafa, he can hold him down. But yeah, he's not Mr. Grappler, and I do think Junior Tafa is deadly on the feet. And look, Chris Barnett, he's been knocked out a few times, twice, 7, 8 years ago. But, you know, I do think it can happen again here, especially now that he's only getting older. He's 38. And I think Junior Tafa, his takedown defense will hold up against what I'm assuming is subpar takedown attacks from Chris Barnett. And I think Junior Tafa will find a way to put him away on the feet. and he's not going to fall apart cardio wise like Jake Collier or whoever. Chris Barnett came in and he's beaten some fatter heavyweights, Jake and Gian Vellante, heavyweight Gian Vellante. But Junior Tafa carries his weight well, and I think he's not going to fall apart cardio wise, and he will eventually TKO Chris Barnett. That's the fucking prediction. But yeah, Junior Tafa is a limited guy. Walter Walker got him out of there with a heel hook in his last fight, just to show that even leg locks, whatever, you can still find a way to beat Junior Tafa in a lot of different ways. But Chris Barnett, it's not like he's got so many tricks up his sleeve. I'm very sure he knows what a heel hook is and a calf kick, but I don't think he's going to be able to work anything on Junior Tafa. I think it'll just be physicality and size and bowling ball pressure to slow down Junior Tafa for Chris Barnett. And look, Chris Barnett does have some flashy shit as well. I mean, maybe one of those spinning kicks will land, and then he could do the fucking Kung Fu Panda jumping around shit. That would be awesome. But Junior Tafa, he's only been TKO'd the once, and it was the leg kicks, really, from Marcos Rogerio de Lima. He's still got a good chin on him. I don't think it's going to be easy to turn the fight around, and I think eventually the guy to actually tire, I say actually, like you'd be surprised, but it'd be the guy who's built like a bowling ball, again, Chris Barnett, and the knockout might come more easily as the fight goes on, even though Tafa generally, I think actually only has gotten first round knockouts. I know there's one in round two. But yeah, I'm going with Junior Tafa. I just think both guys are limited, and even though experience is usually a big thing, I don't think it's going to be enough here, and I've got him winning by knockout. Up next, we have Themba Gorimbo taking on Niko Price. My prediction for this fight is Niko Price wins by round 2 stoppage. Don't ask me why. Look, Niko did not look great in his last few fights, especially his last 2 losses against Robbie Lawler and Philip Rowe. He was TKO'd in both those losses. I mean, he nearly finished Philip Rowe earlier in that 3rd round, but still against Robbie Lawler, he got steamrolled with these short punches in 40 seconds, and it just didn't make him look like the healthiest UFC welterweight. And he's not. He's now over 35, and he's been knocked out in 5 of his 7 losses. 4, really. If you count the Vicente Luque loss. The second one is a doctor stoppage. But still, the health of Niko Price is subpar compared to the UFC welterweights. I just think Themba Gorimbo is not likely to go through his chin. Themba Gorimbo does not have the power of Robbie Lawler or even Philip Rowe or Abdul Razak Alhassan or Jeff Neal, the other guys that have TKO'd Niko Price. Themba's had some success recently with his striking, steamrolling Pete Rodriguez, who, definitely on the lower end of the UFC roster. And he also knocked down Takashi Sato, which does show power. But in general, I've never been too impressed with the striking of Themba Gorimbo. And that's the form in his striking, because he throws a lot of wild, loose arm punches, but also his power altogether. I've never considered a big threat. So I'm going to assume, probably wrongly here, that Niko's chin will keep himself in the fight. And from there, I think Themba's the guy with more vulnerabilities. And I also think Themba's going to try to out-grapple and cling to Niko Price, like he did to Ramiz Brahimaj in his last fight. And I don't think Niko Price is the easiest guy to ragdoll and control. And as the fight goes on, Niko's danger, I think, could show itself. And Themba Gorimbo is a vulnerable guy himself. He's a guy who's lost 4 times, and he's been finished in 3 of those losses. He was submitted twice, once in his first loss to Leon Minhart with a guillotine choke. That's the guy who beat Don Madge 3 times. And he was submitted in his last loss in his first UFC fight to AJ Fletcher with a guillotine choke. And the thing is, he was also knocked into the guillotine choke. against AJ Fletcher with an elbow. And that was the beginning of the end. And he's also been knocked out against this guy, Dave Mazzani. That was 7 years ago, but still it happened. So in addition to having shaky offensive striking, I do think he's a vulnerable guy. And Nico Price, if there's one thing you could say about him, it's he's dangerous. And he's also funky. He'll fucking hit you with some weird shit. Just go ask Randy Brown or James Vick about it. But yeah, Nico's funky. He's a funky grappler as well. And I don't think he's going to want to reach across Themba Gorimbo's body for a Kimura and let him, take his back or whatever if he's taken down. But Nico is still a crafty grappler, like he is a crafty striker. And he's only been submitted ever once, and that was to Vicente Luque in the one clean, legitimate stoppage of his. But still, that was Vicente Luque 7 years ago. He's obviously one of the greatest killers in the last 10 years in the welterweight division, and there's no shame with that guy getting you out of there with a Darce. But Nico, look, he's the slower guy and the older guy, although not too much older, to be honest. But I still think he is overall the more dangerous guy. And I think, his big weakness here, I can't say it's off the table because his chin might have fallen off a cliff, but he stood tall against Alex Morono, and he stood tall in most of his other fights. And I think if his chin is able to stand up to the tricky shots of Themba Gorimbo early, Nico Price will be the bully in there, the more likely finisher. And I also think he'll be in the points battle. I don't think he's the easiest guy to take down and control. And look at what he did to Alex Morono in his last fight. He showed he can mix it in as well. So, although Morono really collapsed there, cardio-wise. But yeah, Nico Price, he hasn't won too much as of late. He was a much more formidable welterweight 5 years ago or whatever. But in general, he's been on the downslide here. And now he's 35. So, yeah, I guess it makes sense he should be an underdog. But I still think this is a matchup that could prove to be favorable for him. So I'll take a shot on Nico Price. And that's not just me talking the bet. I'll pick Nico Price to win as well. I think Themba Gorimbo, if he's not able to, first of all, knock out Nico Price, but second of all, cling to him like a fly on shit, like he did to Brahimai, I think Nico Price's danger will hit the surface. And whereas he couldn't close the show against Phil Rowe, I think he'll find a way to close the show against Themba Gorimbo. Gorimbo's been submitted twice, both guillotines in the second round. Nico Price isn't the greatest submission artist, but he's gotten three, and two of them inside the UFC octagon. Brandon Thatch and George Sullivan, way back when those guys were in the UFC. But yeah, I think if Nico Price is able to hurt Themba Gorimbo, he can close the show. So I've got Nico Price winning, and believe me, the bet won't be too big. Next up, we have Pat Sabatini taking on Jonathan Pearce. My prediction for this fight is Pat Sabatini wins, and I'll go with him winning by a round one submission. This is an interesting battle. Each guy's got weaknesses. Pat Sabatini's biggest weakness, and it might be the biggest weakness in this matchup, is his chin. He's definitely got the shakier chin. We've seen him caught a few times in the UFC, and I think that's definitely a weakness of his moving forward. But I don't think Jonathan Pearce is a guy to exploit that weakness. Jonathan Pearce, typically his finishes come when he's mauling you on the ground. And that could happen here, but I do think Pat Sabatini wins because he's not going to be the easiest guy to grind. In addition to being a beast of a wrestler himself, he's the better jiu-jitsu guy between the two. And speaking of which, Jonathan Pearce's primary weakness, I'd say, is that he can be caught cold. He's been submitted 3 times altogether and TKO'd as well, but the majority of his finishes come in round 1. The one in round 2 comes in his last finish loss to Joe Anderson Brito, where he got ninja choked down the stretch, which still shows it can happen down the stretch. But typically when he's lost, he's been caught cold early. He was TKO'd, I should say, by Joe Lozon. That was a finish on the ground, but Lozon came out like a fucking storm, took his back, and pounded him from a bad position, and ended up getting a stoppage in 90 seconds. And then he was submitted twice early in his career. This guy, Quentin Culpepper, got him with a toe hold, and Lance Lawrence got him with a rear naked choke in 25 seconds. So, yeah, he's been caught cold a bunch, Jonathan Pearce. And Pat Sabatini, even though he's been knocked out cold pretty early, Pat Sabatini's a great submission threat. And he showed when he almost got caught cold against Jamal Emmers a few years ago that he can lace up a leg and show that danger very early in the fight. With that heel hook victory he got against Jamal Emmers. So yeah, I think this is a fight that if it goes the distance, either guy could maybe outgrind the other. I do think Jonathan Pearce is the better grinder, but that might not be the case in this matchup because I don't think he's going to be able to positionally dominate Pat Sabatini so easily. And of course, Sabatini's no slouch in the grinding department anyway. He might outgrind Jonathan Pearce. But as far as getting a finish, I think Sabatini's skills plug into the losses of Jonathan Pearce a lot more effectively than Jonathan Pearce's do Sabatini's weaknesses. So I favor Sabatini here, and I do think if he is the win, it's probably more likely to be a submission and to be early. And that's what I've got happening. Next up, we have Ramazanbek Temirov taking on CJ Vergara. My prediction for this fight is CJ Vergara wins, and I've got him winning by a decision or getting in his face enough till he falls apart in round 3. But either way, it's really just a hunch because look, Temirov's got 2 losses and a draw, and I haven't seen these fights. And you know me, I've scoured the earth. And by the way, if you know where I can find them, please let me know. Although, again, I'm not buying any fucking DVDs or whatever. But Temirov, he does have 2 losses. I did see him avenge one of those losses. The guy that armbarred him, I saw him win a decision against that guy. Still didn't fight a perfect fight, but it was good to see him win a fight over the course of 15 minutes. Most of his wins as of late, the last 4 of them have been finishes, 2 of which have come in Ryzen. But that's the thing. He hasn't fought the best competition, even in Ryzen, which is an excellent MMA league, obviously, organization. But I don't think he's beaten anybody as good as CJ Vergara. And I think CJ Vergara, his record's a little worse because a good chunk of his losses have come in the UFC. And he's already stayed afloat by getting, 3 wins in the UFC already. Clayton Rodriguez, say what you will about the decision, and Vinicius Salvador, as well as Daniel Lacerda, the fucking king of entertainment. And I think CJ Vergara, on that front, it looks like he's very much in this matchup. But also technically, I think Vergara is limited, but Temirov is not likely to exploit the limitations of CJ Vergara. Not as likely, anyway. He's not going to duplicate the success of Almabayev. He might try to duplicate the success that Ode Osborne had with CJ Vergara. I think that's more likely. But still, CJ Vergara, at the very least, I trust his chin here. Yeah, we've seen him knocked around by Daniel Lacerda and whoever, but I still think he's got an excellent chin and he's never been finished. And every other trait in the book, CJ Vergara's got on his side. He's got true fucking grit. True grit. The heart, the cardio to back it all up, and the tenacity. He will keep coming, and that's what gave him the victory over Clayton Rodriguez. It was really close in the end, but he didn't stop fighting, whether it was to survive or to finish, and in the end gave himself a shot at winning that decision. And here, I don't think he's going to get, I think there's a chance he's able to thwart any takedown attacks, if there are any, from Temirov and get the stand-up fight he wants. Temirov has fought that other decision that I saw him win was where he was on the back foot pretty much the whole fight. he can fight on the back foot, and I do think he's faster than CJ Vergara as well. But again, I think CJ Vergara is better than these guys he's fought, and I think he's got every trait going for him. And he's also got some tricks up his sleeve, those excellent knees to the body that got him into the UFC in the first place, and then may have arguably won him the fight against Rodriguez. And I think he can get in Temirov's face and show him what the UFC is all about, so to speak. So that's the prediction. That CJ Vergara gets what is not an unfavorable matchup here against Temirov and gets in his face and gets to showcase all those traits and wins a hard-earned decision. But it's not with a lot of confidence because, again, I've never seen Temirov lose. I know it's happened, but I have no idea what it looks like. That decision could have been bullshit. And the armbar is not a path to victory for CJ Vergara anyway. But still, every now and then, you got to go with your hunch. And I don't think Temirov is going to be able to go through CJ Vergara as easily as his record might show, his UFC record. And I've got CJ Vergara outgrinding Ramazanbek Temirov, even though he's got the name and the rest of it and the pretty record. Up next, we have Chidi Njokuani versus Jared Night Train Gooden. And I may as well use Chidi's nickname, Chidi Bang Bang. Anyway, I'm going with Chidi. I got him winning by decision. He's an incredibly dangerous guy, and Gooden has been knocked out twice. So if he is going to win, a knockout is certainly possible. And both of Gooden's knockout losses come in round one, by the way. But I think a decision would be more likely for him. Maybe slowing the fight down, scaring some of the danger out of Gooden, and winning a decision. But Gooden is very much in this fight. First of all, I think he's got more power than Chidi. I think Chidi is much more dangerous altogether with his kicking game and the rest of it. But I think Jared Gooden hits harder. And even though I mentioned that he was knocked out twice, Chidi Njokuani, he's been TKO'd 5 times. But I have to look to his last loss against Mikhail Oleksiejczuk, where one punch turned the fight around on a dime. And now he's 35 years old. And of course, I'm not saying he's got a bad chin or whatever, but in general, looking more vulnerable lately. And I do think Jared Gooden, on standing up, could have something to offer him as far as fight ending potential goes. But without fight ending potential, I do think Chidi Njokuani gets the better of Jared Gooden on the feet. I think he's able to duplicate the success of a lot of guys who have beaten Gooden in the UFC especially, and he can get the better of him in that fight. Jared Gooden, I think, would win the fight on the ground. I'm not just saying that because he choked out Wellington Turman in such an incredible victory. It was a comeback and whatever. But look, I think Jared is underrated on the ground in the first place. And I also think Chidi Njokuani is still vulnerable on the ground. Even though I think I heard an interview 6 months ago where he said he got his black belt or whatever. But he's still limited and he hasn't patched up all those holes. And at the very least, I think Jared Gooden would physically pin him and hold him down, if not finish him. Chidi can be overwhelmed with ground and pound sometimes, or if you're good enough, maybe you can go through him jiu-jitsu-wise. Still, though, I don't think Gooden is likely to take him to the ground, not easily anyway. And I say this knowing that Gooden has 100% takedown offense in the UFC. But still, Chidi has good takedown defense, and I think level 1 of takedown defense is your footwork and your outside striking and the scary knees up the middle and everything else that stops takedowns from even being attempted in the first place. So I think this one scares me because both guys have been vulnerable, and my pick, he's been quite vulnerable. Chidi Njokuani's got 10 losses. He's been finished in 8 of them. So, yeah, for a 35-year-old, it's got me worried. But I still pick Chidi Njokuani to win. I think his danger is still there, where he can go through Gooden potentially if he lands the right shit early. And I think, his cardio is still there, having those grinding fights with Albert Duraev and Reese McKee. Say what you will about the fights, but they were both grinding fights. And I also think Jared Gooden is not the most likely or not the best overall grappler. I talked about him being underrated and whatever, but he's not such a big force on the ground where I think it's anything close to a bad matchup for Chidi. So I've got Chidi keeping this fight standing, having the better overall striking, especially working his kicks if he can maintain that range. And I also give him a better chance of getting the knockout, despite being finished in 8 of 10 losses and all that shit I was saying 42 seconds ago or whatever. So I'll go with him winning by decision, and I will wait to see the props before I commit to a bet. Next up, we have Abdul Razak Alhassan taking on Josh Fremd. My prediction for this fight is Josh Fremd wins by decision. I do think Josh Fremd, if he is the win, wrestling is going to need to be the story of the fight. I think Abdul Razak Alhassan is just too dangerous for Josh Fremd, where even though Fremd has 4 inches of height, 5 inches of height, and whatever inches of reach, and 10 years of age, and the rest of it all on his side, I think it's only going to be used to survive the storm of Abdul Razak Alhassan. Abdul, he's the most dangerous guy maybe in the fucking world. He's got a 12-6 record, but all 12 of his victories are knockouts. Every one of them in round one, aside from the last fight, the last win, which comes 30 seconds into round two against Claudio Ribeiro. So he is danger personified. And I'm aware, look, he could have won decisions against Omari Akhmedov and Joaquin Buckley. It's not like he got out of round one and he's done fighting. But at least on paper, he's generally done killing you. So Josh Fremd has to get out of round one, and he's got to get this fight to the ground. Because on the feet, even though he's not a bad striker, Josh Fremd, and he's got some knockouts himself, and even knocked down SD Dumas to get the ball rolling there before his guillotine choke, but he's still outgunned on the feet. He's not nearly as fast as Abdul, and the danger coming back his way is just, it's not going to be worth it for him to engage in a give and take on the feet. He's got to avoid taking and get this fight to the ground. And I think Josh Fremd will be able to do that. I think it's going to be difficult early, but I think if he slows down Abdul Razak Alhassan, even by just getting out of round one, dancing on the back foot, which I wouldn't advise. But let's say he did that. I think his chances of getting finished go down, and his chances of getting the takedown go up. And if he's able to get in Abdul's face early in round one and win round one on top of taking away all the danger, then it's Josh Fremd's fight to lose. Fremd has been knocked out. He was knocked out twice. Once was a body shot against Roman Kopylov, and Roman I consider an incredible striker and a better, bigger athlete than Abdul Razak Alhassan. But he still got finished by striking there, and he was knocked out by Gregory Robocop Rodriguez a few years back in the LFA. Those guys are both incredibly dangerous on the feet. Abdul may actually be more dangerous than both. He probably is. But altogether, with their size and the rest of it, those are two very, very good strikers. So there's not a lot of shame there. And those are very good killers as well, powerful guys. But yeah, Josh Fremd, one was a body shot, one was a chin shot. So it's not like he's got a major weakness that could be defined anywhere. I do think he could be knocked out here, of course, and if he lost, it would be a knockout. But I'm saying Josh Fremd is still a 30-year-old who's healthy. And his one submission loss comes to Trayshawn Gore with this guillotine choke that really surprised the hell out of me. I'm sure it surprised him as well. But I still don't know what to make of Trayshawn Gore. However, I'll say this, Abdul Razak Alhassan's one submission loss comes to Joe Pyfer. And I know what to make of Joe Pyfer. He's an excellent fighter, and he's going to be kicking a lot of ass in the future. And he's got UFC contender written all over him. He probably already is a contender. Abdul Razak Alhassan was also knocked out once, and it was by Chaos Williams in 20 seconds or whatever. That was just a big surprise. One shot right through the guard, and he went stiff. It was a very bad knockout loss, but that's Chaos Williams. Josh Fremd does not have that kind of power. He's been able to put some guys away, but he shouldn't be able to duplicate that kind of power. So it's an interesting fight. I think it is pretty much striker versus grappler. Abdul Razak Alhassan has a way of reducing a lot of his opponents to grappler. But I think that's the case here, and I'm picking the grappler. It'll be difficult for him to get in on those hips because he's a lot taller in the rest of it. But I think Josh Fremd survives, slows him down, gets him to the mat, and wins a grimy decision. Up next, we have Daniel Rodriguez taking on Alex Morono. My prediction for this fight is Daniel Rodriguez wins by decision. He doesn't have a lot going for him right now. A lot of negative momentum, I should say. He's coming off of 3 consecutive losses, 2 of which were finish losses. And he's about to turn 38 in another few months. So things seem to be trending away from D-Rod. But he's only got those 3 losses because he's been in there with excellent fighters. And that's because he's beaten a lot of good fighters himself. The worst guy to beat him in his last 3 fights is Neil Magny, even though he actually beat Kelvin Gastelum by decision way back when. So there's that. But my point is, D-Rod, I think, is still above average, even though he doesn't have a lot of momentum. And I think he's going to be too much for Morono. I think he's going to be able to beat Morono on the feet. And I envision a points battle just with D-Rod getting the better points. I think he'll put up better numbers, throw more strikes. And I think he's also the more dangerous guy and the more likely guy to get a finish or a big moment. Morono's deceptively dangerous. He throws harder than anybody will ever give him credit for. But I don't think he's going to be the second guy to knock out D-Rod after Ian Gary, unless D-Rod has completely fallen off a cliff. However, D-Rod, I suppose it's possible for him to be the 5th guy to knock out Alex Morono, even though the Nico Price knockout doesn't count. But still, Morono, he's a guy who's been taken out a few times in the UFC. But look, on the feet, Morono is very much in the fight. I don't think D-Rod is going to run away with it. I think Alex Morono puts up good numbers himself. I think he's tricky with his hand. I think he's lighter on his feet than D-Rod, which will certainly help. But I'm picking against him because on top of D-Rod being more dangerous and I think throwing more, he puts up better numbers. D-Rod also has 2 inches of height and 2 inches of reach. That's not always the story of the fight, but in a fight that I envision being a decision in mostly a kickboxing type of bout, that's an advantage for D-Rod as well. As for the submissions, look, Morono's never been tapped. D-Rod was tapped once by Neil Magny, a round 3 Darce choke in a really tight fight at that point. Morono, he's got better submission skills, but his main weapon is the guillotine. Now, that can come from anywhere, so it's always a problem. You can never exactly, look past it. But I still would be surprised if he was able to submit Daniel Rodriguez. I think maybe he'd have to rock him first before submitting him. But it's not like he hasn't gotten that victory recently. He got a guillotine choke over Tim Means a year and a half ago, which, by the way, D-Rod also got a guillotine choke over Tim Means 6-7 years ago, whatever that was. That's one of his 4 submissions or whatever. He's got more than meets the eye on the ground, but I think, Alex Morono definitely has better jiu-jitsu than him. Still, the ground game could be won from either guy getting on top in this type of fight with nobody really advancing. And I think Morono would be the more likely guy to try to get the fight to the ground, but I think D-Rod would be able to keep it standing in the first place. And also, D-Rod's a bigger man. If he can get on top of Morono, maybe he can make that work to his advantage. But again, I see this fight being contested mostly on the feet, and I've got Daniel Rodriguez winning. I think Morono will be darting in and out, but D-Rod will be meeting his face and timing him with better shots. I've got Daniel Rodriguez winning by decision. Next up, we have Julia Polastri taking on Corey McKenna. My prediction for this fight is Polastri wins by decision. I think it'll go the distance regardless of who wins. But I'm favoring Polastri because I think she's going to be a tough girl to bulldoze and to take down. And I think on the feet, while Corey McKenna is maybe more aggressive, I think Julia Polastri sharper on the feet. So I envision her keeping it standing and winning on the feet. And of course, Julia can mix things up and take you to the ground just as well. I just don't know if that's going to be plan A or not in this fight. But look, Corey McKenna, she's lost 3 times. Once by armbar against Jacqueline Amorim. I don't think that's such a big threat here because Jacqueline Amorim is exceptional. But her other 2 losses are by decision to Mikol Desenyi and Elise Reed. Both girls beat her by split decision, and in general, she wasn't able to take the girls down and was outstruck on the feet. But those are her only 2 losses, and that's not counting the Kay Hansen fight, which, whatever. But look, the Kay Hansen fight was a great example of Corey McKenna scratching and clawing, even in dog shit positions, and her effort won that fight. Although, again, it was really fucking close. But anyway, Palastri's been defeated 4 times, all 4 by decision and all to good fighters. She lost twice in her first 4 fights or whatever, and I wasn't able to see those fights, but I know they're to good fighters, and they're both by decision. And she lost twice in her last 5 fights or so, and they're to Jasmine Jasdavicius on the Contender Series, and in her UFC debut to Josephine Knutzen. Knutzen is an excellent striker, and Polastri was able to take her down, but she still lost the fight. Just wasn't able to secure the control at the right times. A little too late with that first takedown, and she lost, but it was still a good fight. And against Jasmine Jasdavicius, she was taken down. And even though she lost a unanimous decision, and Jasmine's gone on to be an above-average UFC fighter, I still thought she gave one hell of a fight to Jasdavicius. That was really close, kind of. Deceptively close. And in like an O'Malley versus Dwalishvili kind of way. But I do think she handled herself well against what looked like it could have been a nightmare matchup for her. Jasdavicius taking her down. And Julia Polastri was still going for it at the end, taking it to her, despite knowing she could be taken down again. But yeah, I don't think Corey McKenna has the takedown prowess of Jasdavicius, certainly. She's a wrestler on a different level, and I don't think she's got the striking of Knutzen. And I do think, just from having watched them fight, Julia Polastri is the more technical fighter. So I'm favoring Polastri to win. I think she can out-technique Corey McKenna on the feet or even win the wrestling battle and win the ground game as well. Corey McKenna's a little bigger, a little more physical, and a little more aggressive to complement all that. But I've got Polastri figuring her out, slowing her down, and winning by decision. Next up, we have Rafa Garcia taking on Grant Dawson. My prediction for this fight is Grant Dawson wins by finish. I think he's the first person to stop Rafa Garcia, and I'll go with a round 3 rear naked choke or face crank or neck crank or something. But back control, as you might imagine, is the story of that finish. Even if he gets a TKO, I think it'll be from a mount or back mount. But if he's not able to win that wrestling battle, if Rafa Garcia is able to get him off his hips and keep Grant Dawson at bay, then it becomes very interesting. I still think Grant Dawson has a lot to offer Garcia on the feet because Garcia is limited, but Grant Dawson is definitely a little shaky there. He's vulnerable. He's only got 2 losses, and they're both him being knocked out anyway in 30 seconds. I don't know if he was unconscious or not. But Hugh Pulley TKO'd him with Travis Brown elbows, and he looked like he went limp there for a split second. And Bobby Green knocked him out with a beautiful counter shot and then pounded him out. So he's been caught cold, and by cold, again, I mean 30 seconds cold, twice. Now, I'm not saying that's how every loss of his will look. I'm not even saying he'll ever lose again. But I'm saying that's how he's been stopped in the past. And Rafa Garcia, definitely does not have that danger. I mean, he's got a record of 16-3, and in those 16 victories, he's only got one win by knockout, just one. So stands the reason that he's not going to be able to duplicate the success of Bobby Green and Hugh Pulley. And I think Grant should win this fight. Look, Rafa Garcia, he's been the dominant wrestler in his UFC fights, but he's still been taken down. And here I think he's fighting the dominant wrestler and dominant overall grappler in Grant Dawson. I think Grant has better wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and I think one leads to another. And I envision him taking control of this fight after a few minutes, maybe a minute or so, and then really not relinquishing control until the beginning of the round when they're forced to stand up again and whatever. But yeah, Grant, I mentioned his losses. I got to mention his wins. He's gotten third round finishes over Jared Gordon, over Marco Madsen, over Leonardo Santos, knocked out the jiu jitsu guy with a second left. Got to talk about him beating Derek Minner and Mike Trezano to start his UFC career off. And actually, he started off by beating Julian Erosa by decision. And his best win would probably be over Damir Ismagulov, even though Damir is still underrated. But he beat him by decision, and yeah, his grappling was dominant there. I just think Grant Dawson is such a force on the ground that this is going to prove to be a bad matchup for Rafa Garcia. Of course, if Rafa Garcia can take away that grappling in some way, it becomes incredibly interesting. But that's not something I'm even going to bet on, really, let alone pick. So I'll take Grant Dawson winning a Grant Dawson fight. Could be a decision, but I've got him securing a finish. I'll go with round 3. Round 2 is always possible. But Grant Dawson doing Grant Dawson things is the prediction. And in the co-main event, we had Brad Tavares versus Jun Young Park. My prediction for this fight is Jun Young Park wins the decision. I do think Brad has been in there with such a great level of competition that it makes him look worse than he is, even in this matchup here. But I still think it's undeniable that he's the less durable fighter. Even if he's fought much better competition, he's still much older and he's been knocked out a bunch and knocked out twice in his last 2 losses, actually. And the last of which was against Gregory Robocop Rodriguez earlier this year. And Jun Young Park actually lost to Robocop as well by knockout. He was seconds away from knocking him out, and then he got a little overzealous and got countered and ended up getting put away. But that's the only guy to put away Jun Young Park. Brad Tavares has been knocked out 4 other times as a pro, and that's not counting his knockout loss on the Ultimate Fighter against Seth Baczynski, where he was soccer kicked. So it doesn't really count as a professional loss, but it does count as a concussion. Still, I'm not trying to harp on concussions from years ago, but I'll say he's been knocked out twice in the last year and a half. Bruno Silva and Gregory Rodriguez. And he's a guy who's about to turn 37 years old. Jun Young Park hasn't knocked out anybody in a long time. But like I said, he was close to getting Gregory Rodriguez out of there, and he definitely hits hard. So there's a chance he could go through the chin of Tavares, but I don't think so. I think if he wins this fight, his most likely path to victory is a decision. I think he'll have a hard time getting Tavares down. That's probably plan A for Jun Young Park in most fights. But here, Tavares has excellent takedown defense where I don't think he's going to be able to get him down. But I do think he'll be able to get in his face. And I don't think Tavares is going to be that much quicker than him where he'll be able to dance around Jun Young Park. Not for 15 minutes. I think Park will get in his face and rough him up a little bit. Probably have the more effective strikes, but in general, pressure him and win a decision. There's a chance it's a favorable matchup for Tavares because he's able to keep it standing and he's not fighting such a big knockout threat in Jun Young Park. I think that won't be the case, but there's a chance it is. And look, Brad Tavares, I don't have to go through everybody he's beaten, but he's proven in the past, in his prime, that he's capable of beating somebody like Park. But I just have to go with Park here. Park as of late in the last plus years, he's only lost to guys who were able to thoroughly out grapple him. Andre Muniz, uh, well, Gregory Rodriguez is the guy who knocked him out, so I guess not that. But before that, it was Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. And the loss before that actually came to Shavkat Rakhmonov, where he was doing well early in round one against Shavkat, but then Shavkat went through him in round two. But yeah, he's been in there with good fighters for a long time now, and he's already been in the UFC for almost 5 years, or maybe even over 5 years. So Junyoung Park, he may not have the experience of Brad Tavares, but he's definitely been there and done that. And I'm thinking he's in his prime now, and he should beat Brad Tavares. Again, stylistically, it may not work out where he's going to get the rear naked choke or whatever, but I think Junyoung Park gets in Brad Tavares' face and wins a decision. That's the prediction. I bet on Park, and I'll wait to see the props to see if I should invest any more money and how to do that. And in the main event of the evening, we have Tatsuro Taira taking on Brandon Royval. My prediction for this fight is Taira wins, and I'll go with him winning by decision. But I can never commit to decision with either guy because they're both such dangerous fighters and they're such excellent grapplers. And I do envision Taira winning by being on top and grappling. I think Tatsuro Taira is the stronger man. And of course, I think he's got excellent submission skills and grappling skills. And I would think he's going to try to slow Brandon Royval down a little bit. And maybe after he slows him down enough, try to work on a finish. Because when you're all action and you're firing on all cylinders, I really think that's a fight Brandon Royval wins against anybody. Royval, he's got a lot of great experience. He's, I'd say, the more dangerous guy on the feet. Taira probably hits harder, and he showed he can be dangerous at the UFC level against Carlos Hernandez last year. But Brandon Royval, I got to look to the guy that knocked out Mateus Nikolay, that beautiful knee. And I got to look to the guy, frankly, who outstruck Brandon Morono in his most impressive victory, one of his few decisions. And it's a 5-round decision victory over Brandon Morono, who is still, number 3 in the world or whatever. So yeah, Royval's got a really high standing. I mean, since he's been in the UFC, he's only got 2 legitimate losses, and they're both to Alexandre Pantoja, the champion of the world. He had another loss to Brandon Morono where he was injured, a TKO in round 1, but I don't lean on injuries too much. Although Tatsuro Taira did get a nice injury victory in his last fight, and that was with back control, so what do I know? Maybe that's actually a nice path to victory for him. But assuming Royval doesn't get injured on the ground or when they're tied up, the one guy to put him away was Pantoja with a rear naked choke in their first fight. Pantoja, who's a dominant grappler and really strong, was able to slow Royval down, pin him, slow him down, and strangle him. Of course, in the rematch, Royval went all 5 rounds with Pantoja. He did not get strangled, but Pantoja really stopped that from being an action-packed fight. Because you don't want to be in an action-packed fight with Brandon Royval. Go ask Kai Kara France. He'll tell you all about it. But yeah, Royval is incredibly dangerous. I think his record is deceptively weak, 16-7. I mean, I should say deceptively strong. Those 7 losses, a lot of them are in the past. But again, in the UFC, and he's been in the UFC for a while now, the only guy to truly best him was Alexandre Pantoja. And the guys he's beaten, even before he first fought Pantoja, have been incredible. He came out of the gate with 2 awesome wins, finishes over Kai Kara France and Tim Elliott. I mean, what a way to make your entrance. And then since then, he's beaten Matt Schnell and Mateus Nikolay, Rogerio Bontorin in a fight that I thought could have been very dangerous for him, and Brandon Morono, most impressively. And that was a real hard fight, a good grind for Royval to beat Brandon Morono. And here I think it could work for him that he has 5 rounds to work with, or 5 rounds with which to work, if I can hit you with a John Anikism. But he's still fighting a guy who's never been beaten, Tatsuro Taira. I don't know what it's going to look like when he is beaten. Thought he could have lost a round here or there to Alex Perez. But Taira has still shown every trait in the book. He's shown to be every bit as dangerous as somebody like Royval. So I think this one here, I'm picking Taira to win because I think he can potentially finish Royval by getting on top of him. And if not, I think he can definitely win by getting on top of him. And on the outside, on the feet, look, I think Taira has proven to be a good striker. I liked his rangy kicks from when he got into the UFC. But of course, seeing him steamroll Carlos Hernandez or knock him out was really nice. And I think on the feet, he's perhaps more powerful than Royval. But I still think Brandon Royval has more going on. I think if these two guys are kickboxing, the first knockout, I'd favor Royval. Just again, I haven't seen him knock out Mateus Nikolay with that knee and whatever. And also, I think he wins the point kickboxing battle, kind of like he did with Brandon Morono, especially down the stretch. But again, none of these things I'm saying are locks by any means. I don't know what Taira's going to look like when he loses, and I don't know if he'll ever fucking lose. But for my sake, I hope it's not in this fight because I'm picking him to win. Again, I'll go with him winning by decision, although 5 rounds is pretty scary. But I think he'll decide at some point when he feels the danger of Royval that he needs to really slow this fight down and just maintain control. And I think, you know what, if he does do that, the finish possibilities will open up because Taira is exceptionally dangerous, very technical. He's got more than one way to win, a bunch of different submissions in the bag, and he's great from every position. So, yeah, I'm thinking he wins it, but I'm hoping more than anything for a very exciting fight. And I think we will get that. God, I hope it's not another fucking injury. But yeah, I'm going with Tatsuro Taira. I'm taking him to win by decision. I've already bet on him, which covers every fucking path to victory because there's no props yet. And I'll wait for the props and see if anything else jumps out. Like, share, subscribe, all that horse shit, and check out my other videos.